Hi guys, this video is an introduction to a piece of software for dedicated arcade cabinets that I've been working on called the Arcade Emulator-Integration Player, or just arcadeEIP for short. It's designed to be run either standalone as a live-style game switcher, or from within a conventional graphical front end to extend its features. The primary motivation to create this software took its cue from the observation that traditional arcade machines, while dormant, don't display front-end menus or screensavers, but a native attract mode. The important distinction being that their design should permit a passerby to immediately start playing whatever game they see on the screen, and then simply walk away when they're done. arcadeEIP focuses on making that kind of spontaneous gameplay work for multi-game arcade cabinets by always having a live game active and ready to play, but still making it easy to select arbitrary games or return to an underlying conventional front end when or if desired. The key to making this work was to design the software to be more of a back-end live game switcher than a front-end game launcher. The idea being that once an initial seed game is launched, you only ever switch between live games from that point forward, with no requirement to exit a game first before selecting a new one. That's why the software is called a player rather than a launcher. I suppose you could say that it behaves a bit like an arcade jukebox. Of course, underneath it all, one must still be able to launch games in order to switch them, and so an important enabling feature of the software is to provide a good launch engine, and in the case of arcadeEIP, it's a pretty capable one, supporting advanced features such as native support for multiple parallel versions of MAME, custom rules, individual game launch behavior overrides, system aggregation, and more, all the while supporting the ability to launch any game using one simple and common command line structure. To illustrate some of these basic launch features before getting into the more player-oriented features, let's start at the command line to see a simple example of how to use arcadeEIP to launch a game. This is done by providing EIP with a vector to the game. A vector is just a system name followed by a game name, either in part or in whole. For example, here we've entered EIP, which is the name of the executable, followed by MAME, which is the system name, and Galaxian, which is obviously the game name. This launches Galaxian fully configured, including all of its parameters, control panel configuration, etc. In other words, it runs just as we would expect from any conventional launcher or front end. Now let's try a different game running under a different emulator. Suppose we want to run Dragon's Lair in the Daphne Laserdisc emulator. Again, we specify the system, in this case Daphne, and enough of the game name to be unique, in this case Lair. Again, this launches with all of its supporting configuration.
Dragon's Lair, a fantasy adventure where you become...
Let's try one more. If what you type in as the game name is unique enough, you don't even really need to supply the system name, as arcadeEIP will search through all games for all systems to find a match. For example, if I just type EIP Yars, this will run Yars Revenge from the Atari 2600 on my Stella emulator. That's because Yars Revenge happens to be the first game found among all emulated games on my machine with the subtext Yars. When used like this, at the command line that is, you can think of EIP as a kind of front end for your fingers. There's a lot more that could be said about the command line features of the software, but all this is documented. And to keep this video from getting bogged down on minutia, I'll just mention two more launcher features that may be of interest before moving on to the higher level features. The first is support for multiple parallel versions of emulators like MAME, a feature that's turned on by default. To see a good example of why this is nice to have, let me go ahead and run Zaxxon. Now note while this is loading that you can see that it's launching in version 229, which is currently the most recent version of MAME I have on my system. However, I noticed that when I play the game, sound is missing when my ship blows up. This is actually a great illustration of the sort of thing one runs into with some regularity when using MAME. And we can see that there's no sound. Now, I was pretty sure the sound worked in the previous rev I was using, so how do I revert? Well, if you still have your old versions of MAME around, and you can see I have several here in sequential order, you can go to MAME 229 in this case, which is my current version, and find the ROM file, zaxxon.zip, and either delete it or rename it. I'm going to put an exclamation point in front of it. In this way, arcadeEIP won't be able to find that ROM anymore in this version. So what it will do is it will go back and it will look in whatever the most recent previous version is in which it can find the ROM. In this case, if I go into version 222 of MAME, I can see that I do have a Zaxxon ROM there. So let's go back and try it again. EIP, MAME, Zaxxon. If we look at the status text now, we can see that because the ROM was missing from 229, it's being launched in version 222 now, which happens to be the most recent previous version I have that contains the ROM. And observe that when I play, that there's now sound when the ship explodes. Nice. Basically, the way it works is that if multiple versions of MAME exist on a machine, ROMs will be automatically run in the highest version that the ROM is found in. Other than making sure your folders conform to a sequential naming pattern, that's all there is to making it work. The final thing I'll show you before moving on, since it turns out to be a rather powerful capability, is the software's support for Sidecar Files. To see one example of how this can be used, let's try running Star Wars Trilogy in MAME. Now, if you're an emulator geek, you probably already know that Star Wars Trilogy doesn't run very well in MAME, as you can kind of see here. It's very, very slow, for one thing. And there are also various kinds of graphical glitches. However, there is a Sega Model 3 emulator called Supermodel that will run this game in a much more playable fashion. Since I only really use Supermodel for this one game, wouldn't it be nice if there was a way to have Supermodel proxy for MAME in this one instance? Well, there is. To do this, I navigate over to my main ROMs folder, and in that folder I create a text file, and I give that text file the name of my ROM, in this case swtrilogy.txt. Then I use Notepad to open up this file, and inside I add the vector to Star Wars Trilogy, however, to Star Wars Trilogy running in my Sega Model 3 system. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I save this file, and once that's done, I should be able to now try running it again. Let's see what happens. Now, if you look at the bottom of the screen as this begins to load, you'll see that it's no longer running in MAME, but it's running in our Sega Model 3 emulator. You'll also notice that once the game comes up, that the performance is much better, and as it turns out, it's much more playable. These sidecar files are also called proxy files, and can be quite useful when used in conjunction with a front end, since I don't have to make any changes in the front end's configuration or my command line to make this work. I can simply choose Star Wars Trilogy from my MAME list, and it will automatically run in Supermodel. Well, that's enough low-level stuff. Let's finally go back and take a look at the higher-level player-oriented features I mentioned earlier, along with the front-end integration capabilities I also hinted at. To do this, I'll start up GameEx with arcadeEIP as a wrapper. That's right, I can launch GameEx, which happens to be the graphical front end I use, in EIP just like a system. It isn't strictly necessary to launch our front end this way, but doing it like this provides a bit more control over how EIP acts with GameEx specifically. Once I'm in GameEx here, everything works normally until I launch an emulator configured to call EIP. So let me go ahead and choose a game from MAME. Let's say it's Galaxian again. The first thing you'll notice is that we see the same splash screen that we saw earlier when I launched from the command line. This should be your first clue that EIP has managed the launch. Now that we're in the game, I can go ahead and play the game normally as expected. However, because the game is running under arcadeEIP, there's some new behavior. One is that after I'm done playing, I can just walk away and let EIP's AutoSwitcher begin to cycle. So I've now stopped playing the game, so let's wait a bit for that to happen. Since I have the scheduler set for just 20 seconds for demonstration purposes, we won't have to wait too long. Okay, EIP is just auto-switched games. While similar to a screensaver, there's one crucial difference. Unlike conventional front-end screensaver-style attract modes, which bring you back to the front end if you jiggle on a stick or press a button, which we see isn't happening here, I can just go ahead and start playing the new game displayed. Now, if at any time I'd like to go, say, back to the previous game in the list, I can press a key to do that. Here, let's go back to Galaxian. I can also move forward to the next game in the list. Okay, now we're back to Gyrus again, which I can continue playing. I can even program buttons to directly switch to any specific favorite game. For example, let's suppose the signature game on my cabinet was Defender, which it kind of is in my case. I could program a button on my control panel to launch it by simply setting it to an EIP hotkey that launches that particular game. Now here's something to take note of. So far you'll notice that we have played a number of games, but in all of this time we have never once had to explicitly exit a game. We have only ever switched games, and we have not needed to return to our front end to do so. But now, let's suppose I got it in my head that I wanted to play some arbitrary game, say Seamus on the Atari 800. For that, of course, I could just exit back to GameEx and select the game from there, since I do happen to have it configured there. However, EIP does come with its own integrated quick switch menu that I can also use if preferred. By default, the way to access this is to press the exit button, just as I would conventionally use to return to my front end. And I can press the exit button to go back to my game again. But I did intend to play Seamus now, didn't I? So let's press the exit button to go back into our menu. This brings us to the Master Favorites list, which I'll get to in a moment, but for now I'm going to slide over to the Atari 800 menu and go down to try to find Seamus. There it is. Whoops. Okay. To launch that, I just pressed my main fire button. Now keep in mind that Seamus here is running under the Altera Atari 8-bit emulator, not MAME. EIP doesn't actually care what emulators you use, as long as they're able to be configured to work correctly with the software. Any game that's configured to work in EIP, no matter the emulator, can also be used in the auto switch and direct switch modes as well. You will note that as I start playing, my control panel has been remapped to support the Atari 800 keys. This is achieved by EIP's ability to launch my control panel's profiling software with the correct profiles for this system prior to loading the game. In my case, I use Ultimark's WinIPAC and UltraStick software. Now if I'm done playing and want to return to the menu to choose a different game, I just press exit again, choose my new game here. Let's choose Missile Command Rev 3 and launch it. Now let me describe a bit more how this menu screen works. The first thing I'll mention is that you will always be returned to where you last left off as shown here, unless this is the first time you've used the menu in this session. In that case, you'll start on the Master Favorites list, which serves as a home list. That's why it's in yellow. This Master Favorites list is an automatically compiled list of all favorites selected in all systems. For example, if I scroll down using my joystick here, I can see some MAME games, so those must be favorites in my MAME system, but this next one is from the Atari 2600, so it must be a favorite in my 2600 system. To the left of the Master Favorites are custom lists that you create yourself, which start out empty and whose contents you can manage right here within the GUI. In this case, I have a shooters list and a golden age list. Then to the right of Master Favorites are all your system game collections. These system lists are automatically created and populated based on where you told EIP their ROMs or proxy files are located during configuration. By default, the game names in these lists are simply the names of those files. However, arcadeEIP does support name map files in the same format as MAME and GameEx's map files. So if you point EIP to those files as resources, your lists can use the mapped names in those files. Every list that I've just shown has two states. Either it displays all games in that system like this, or you can toggle it to show that list's favorites, like this, which puts a star in front of the system's name. Adding to a favorites list is just a matter of selecting a game and toggling its status. To show how adding to favorites works, let me scroll over to my ColecoVision list. Now if I toggle to show the favorites list, you can see that it's empty. I'll toggle back, and I'll go down and select a few games. Antarctic Adventure would be a good one. Aqua Attack, and one more. BC's Quest for Tires. Now if I toggle back to my favorites list, we can see that all three of those have been added. Let's go back and add one more. We'll do Blockade Runner. Once again, I press the space bar in this instance, and we can see that Blockade Runner has been added. I can also delete from this list as well by just pressing the space bar in the same way that I added them, but inside of the favorites list. Let's delete all four of them here, for example, and our list goes back to being empty. So that's pretty much how you add games to the favorite list. By the way, even the master favorites list supports favorites. I guess you could call those your favorite favorites. One last thing of importance here is the AutoSwitch list, which is a special custom list over here to the left of master favorites. This is the list of games that auto-switch on a schedule, for example every 5 minutes, once every half hour, or at specific times a day. This list can be managed manually right here, though by default it is set up to automatically compile and maintain a list of the top most played games. Importantly, this list can support any emulated game that you have configured in EIP, not just MAME games, though you do need to specify which systems will participate in auto-switching. In the end, however, keep in mind that the primary intent of the Quick Switch menu is speedy game switching, and as such is a one-screen solution heavily optimized towards that single goal and not intended as a replacement for graphical front ends that provide more embellished animated screens, game selection wheels, and in-depth game data. To get that, all you need to do is press the exit button, and you'll be right back in your front end where you can return to see all that kind of stuff. Oh yes, and just one more thing. If you'd prefer to use arcadeEIP independent of any other front end, you may do so by simply typing EIP with nothing following on the command line. When executed like this, arcadeEIP will pick a seed game from its playlist and start up in auto-switching mode, which is effectively its front end. If you start up this way, everything works the same and the quick switch menu remains accessible just as before via the exit key. The only difference is that when you do a full exit of the software, you'll return back to the operating system rather than inside your front end. So there you have it, at least in a very highly summarized form. If you want more information, download the software and read the documentation, or you can suggest more videos, though I don't know how quickly I'll be able to create them. It really depends on the demand. If you have any questions, please ask in the thread where the link to this video was posted, and hopefully I'll be looking. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel if you like.